Before we had the infamous failed franchise starter of 2017's The Mummy, we had a false start with 2014's Dracula Untold. Much like The Mummy, this film was a big budget adaptation of the classic movie monster with all kinds of spectacle and CGI battles that was meant to lead into other projects. But after this film underperformed at the box office and was hit with poor reviews, these sequel plans were thrown into question. So join me today as we revisit this franchise that never was. We'll explore the history, and I'll offer up some of my thoughts on why it missed the mark with so many theater goers. The idea for Dracula Untold can be traced back 7 years prior. The director of I, Robot and the Crow, Alex Proyas, was hired by Universal Studios in 2007 to direct a picture based on Vlad the Impaler, then known as Dracula Year Zero. Matt Sazama and Burke Sharpless were the writers behind this script, who we've talked about many times on this channel, as they also wrote the masterpieces Morbius, Madam Web, 2017's Power Rangers, and Gods of Egypt. Additionally, Sam Worthington was set to play the lead, and a release date of 2011 was set. However, Universal ended up shutting down this version of the film due to concerns over the budget. This project would stay in limbo for a time until it was revived in 2012, this time with Gary Shore at the helm, who would make his feature film debut directing this movie. Sam Worthington would also leave the project, being replaced by Luke Evans, who you may recognize from The Hobbit or Beauty and the Beast. Or you may know him as that guy who looks like Orlando Bloom. I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking that Orlando Bloom starred in this movie for the longest time. Sharpless and Sazama would rewrite the script, and a release date of August 8th of 2014 was set. More actors were added to the cast, such as Dominic Cooper, Sarah Gadon, and Charles Dance. Charlie Cox was cast in an unknown role, and Samantha Barks was cast as Baba Yaga, but all of their scenes ended up getting cut from the final picture. Principal photography kicked off in August of 2013, shooting primarily in Northern Ireland. By the end of production, the budget was estimated to be around $70 to $100 million. But I'm more inclined to believe it was that higher figure, since this is an expensive period piece and features lots of visual effects. And of course, this budget figure doesn't account for marketing, distribution, or the theater's cuts. In 2013, the release date was pushed back to October 3rd, and then kicked back one more week to October 10th. In its opening weekend, Dracula Untold made $23 million, coming in at number 2 in the box office behind Gone Girl. Domestically, it would make $56 million, and overseas it would rake in $160 million for a total worldwide gross of $217 million. And against that budget of $70 to $100, it's uncertain how much money this movie made or lost, especially with how Hollywood does their accounting. In my opinion, it wasn't quite a box office dud, but it was bordering on it, and it was certainly below what Universal hoped it would gross. The reviews also pointed towards it being a failure, as they skewed mostly negative. The film currently holds a rotten 26% critic and 58% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, in addition to a 6.2 out of 10 on IMDb and a 2.6 out of 5 on Letterboxd. But this is not where the story ends. I go more into depth into this in my Mummy video, but just a quick recap. In July of 2014, Universal unveiled their plans to start an MCU-like cinematic universe based on classic movie monsters, which would later be given the title The Dark Universe. A whole slate of films were announced in 2017 alongside this infamous picture, which had Johnny Depp as the Invisible Man and Russell Crowe as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, among many others. In 2014, Alex Kurtzman and Chris Morgan were officially put in charge of this new potential franchise in a Kevin Feige-like role, and they were currently working on a new Mummy movie with Tom Cruise, which would come out in 2017. Universal decided they wanted Dracula Untold to be a part of this new dark universe, after principal photography had already wrapped. So in June of 2014, they sent the Dracula Untold crew back onto set for some additional photography to shoot a new ending which would position the characters in modern day so they could take part in this new cinematic universe. However, there's also some reports that deny this was the reason for these reshoots. Here's a quote from The Hollywood Reporter. A Universal rep denies Untold will kick off the Monsters universe, and some insiders insist that the new scenes were added not for the sake of inserting Evans into the Monsterverse, but because first-time director Gary Shore delivered an ending that did not resolve the love story in a satisfying way. But it's also worth mentioning that Kurtzman and Morgan were brought in to consult on the film, so I think it's pretty likely they were hoping this movie would kickstart the Dark Universe. After Dracula Untold did somewhat okay at the box office and got terrible reviews, Universal tried to underplay how important this movie was in this new film franchise. And they built up hype for the new Mummy movie instead as the official start of the Dark Universe. 2017's The Mummy was also hit with an underwhelming box office and poor reviews, so that film was the final nail in the coffin for the Dark Universe. which meant a sequel to Dracula Untold was no longer in the cards. Since then, Universal have pivoted to standalone low-budget monster movies such as 2020's The Invisible Man and 2025's The Wolfman, instead of these big-budget tentpole franchise films. And it's probably for the best. So now that we know the history behind the film and how it failed to launch a franchise, let me offer up some of my personal thoughts on why this film didn't land for some viewers. But before we do that, I'd like to talk to you about the sponsor of today's video, Factor. My dog and I go for walks every morning, and sometimes I don't want to go through the hassle of cooking and cleaning breakfast. With Factor's fresh, never frozen meals, they arrive straight to your door, you pop them in the microwave, and boom, breakfast is served. It's so quick and easy, which is especially good for a guy like me who has the culinary skills of a caveman. Not only that, but they have their grab-and-go options, such as their chicken Caesar salad, which is killer. Eating clean has never been easier thanks to Factor. I'm also a big seafood guy, and lucky for me, Factor recently expanded their menu with twice as many seafood options as before. So head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code IsenhartFB50 to get 50% off your first Factor box, plus 1 year of free breakfast. That's code IsenhartFB50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first Factor box and 1 year of free breakfast. Once again, thank you so much to Factor for sponsoring this video. Now back to Dracula Untold. Alright, first a recap of the plot for all of you out there who have not seen the film, which means spoilers ahead. This story follows Vlad Dracula, who is the Prince of Wallachia in Transylvania. As a child, he was a royal ward under the Ottoman Empire's Sultan, where he was trained to be an elite warrior and was given the nickname Vlad the Impaler for, you guessed it, impaling people. While on a scouting mission, he discovers some dead people in a stream, which leads him to a spooky cave that has a mysteriously powerful entity stuck inside it. More on that later. When he gets back to his castle, his feast is interrupted by the Ottoman Empire, who requires Vlad to give up 1,000 boys for the Empire's army, including his son. While Vlad initially agrees, he changes his mind and kills a bunch of Ottoman soldiers, which sparks a war. Vastly outnumbered, he goes back to the spooky cave and finds Tywin Lannister, who agrees to give him magical vampire powers for 3 days. If he can resist the urge to drink blood, the powers will go away, and he will be normal again. But if he munches down on some neck, then he'll be a vampire forever, and Tywin Lannister will be free. So Dracula puts the smackdown on the Ottoman Empire, but during the final battle on the 3rd day, he makes a crucial mistake and leaves his family for some revenge on the battlefield. He gets tricked, his wife dies, his son is captured, and the bad guys escape. Vlad then sucks on some blood, which means he's a vampire forever, and the other vampire in the cave gets to go free. Vlad dons some sick armor, gives a bunch of other people some vampire powers, and goes and destroys the rest of the Ottoman troops. Then for some reason, these other vampires want to kill his son, so he lets the sun come out and burn them all, including himself. But he's saved by some random dude who nurses him back to health, and then we time jump to modern day where Dracula sees some girl that looks like his dead wife. They go off together and Tywin Lannister shows up and says, "Let the games begin," and then the movie ends. Going into Dracula Untold, I was really expecting the worst, especially given who the screenwriters are. But I'm happy to report that this movie is somewhat competent and not that bad. However, it still has many flaws, which we will get into in a moment. I think the biggest sin a movie can commit is being boring, and luckily, I was entertained while watching this movie. It's a tight 90 minutes, so it doesn't overstay its welcome. The action is mostly decent, the characters are easy to digest, and you can care about the story enough. It's what some people would call a popcorn flick. It's very light entertainment, which you will forget about in a day. And that's okay. I'm just so glad it's not a chore to sit through like I, Frankenstein or 2017's The Mummy. Luke Evans is pretty decent in the lead role. He manages to balance the humanity of this character with the moments of darkness and evil that crack through every once in a while. I did find it a bit weird that they made Vlad the Impaler the hero of the story, as in the movie they kind of brush over the fact that he impaled thousands of people, many of which were innocent, and he also gets turned into like the most famous evil villain of all time, Dracula. Like, they do mention it and he shows remorse, but they also try to make him like a righteous hero, and I felt like they never got the right tone for this character. Speaking of tone, this is a very different take on the Dracula story than what we've been accustomed to, and while it worked for me, I could see how it wouldn't go over well with other viewers. Dracula is basically turned into a superhero in this movie, with the action and spectacle taking precedence over pretty much everything else. I liked that this movie had a different take on this character, but if you wanted a more classic horror movie, you're not going to find it here. I gotta say, the story is pretty generic. It follows all the beats you would expect it to and doesn't throw anything too interesting at you. I found the main villain to be a major weak spot. He is just the stereotypical evil royalty that wants power and land and to conquer and blah blah blah. He's woefully underdeveloped, and I was hoping for some supernatural twist to keep things interesting, but no, he's just some dude. It's just a very boring villain that offers absolutely nothing to the movie. But I was a big fan of Charles Dance. His character was super interesting, and that scene in the cave was probably the best one in the entire movie. I wish we could have got some more material with him, or even just a little bit more of his backstory. Allegedly, in an earlier draft of the film, he was revealed to be the Roman Emperor Caligula, but this was cut out with the intention of exploring it in the sequel. I'm pretty split on the action. While it's entertaining at parts, such as that first fight scene where he decimates the invading army, it does lack a lot of suspense and weight. Dracula is just so ridiculously overpowered that in any given scene, you don't feel like he's in danger at all, especially given that these armies decide to attack solely at night. It really strips the action of all its bite when your protagonist can't get hurt or die, and it results in action with no stakes. Really, he's not in danger and there's no stakes until the very end, which is like the bare minimum for a story. I think that the "let the games begin" ending was really stupid and completely unnecessary, especially since it ends with a sequel tease that doesn't really make sense and will never be followed up on. It's just a very overconfident move that you see studios make all the time, which is always so cringe and embarrassing in retrospect. They should have just cut the modern day scene out altogether, as it feels totally tacked on. The last 10 minutes as a whole, with the deus ex machina of some random guy bringing Dracula back to life, was very quick and jarring. I get that he showed up earlier in the movie, but like, come on, this was stupid. Honestly, the story would have been better with Dracula staying dead, but obviously they can't do that, so they decided to resurrect him even after he completed his character arc, and he got redemption by sacrificing himself for his kid. But overall, it's a completely entertaining, passable movie that has a fair amount of flaws, and that's alright. So, let's wrap it up. 2014's Dracula Untold was Universal Studios' big-budget modern take on the classic character of Count Dracula, which was meant to spawn a franchise of its own. While it was originally meant just to have a direct sequel, it was retroactively folded into the Dark Universe once shooting had already wrapped. But once 2017's The Mummy crashed and burned, any follow-up plans were quickly abandoned. So that's the story behind Dracula Untold, yet another franchise that never was. But what are your thoughts on the film? Have you seen it? I'd love to know down in the comments. This has been Tom from Isenhart Productions, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week. And here's a sneak peek of next week's video.